I want to begin the sermon series by asking what seems like a very basic, straightforward question, but as it turns out, a question by no means that has a very basic, straightforward answer. The question is this: who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? For the past 2,000 years, Jesus has captured the minds and imaginations of billions of people. He is the only religious historical figure to appear on the cover of Time magazine, published in over 180 countries, and he's appeared in Time magazine over 20 times. He is cited in very positive terms by many world religions like Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism. Philosophers like Hegel or Kierkegaard, they love to revere him. But there's also philosophers like Nietzsche or Bertrand Russell who love to disagree with him. Some politicians love to quote him. Many celebrities pretend to like him, even if they don't always like to live like him. So who is Jesus? Who is he? In the 90s and early 2000s, there was a group of around 70 to 100 individuals. Many of them were scholars, but most of them were not. And this was a group of people called the Jesus Seminar. And one of the main conclusions was that Jesus, for all intents and purposes, was just a first century traveling rabbi. He had a ragtag group of disciples who were mostly illiterate, who mostly did not really understand who he was or where he was coming from or where he was going. And they all claimed that he died. And they all claimed that he rose from the dead, and that's about it. However, while the Jesus Seminar's conclusions are collecting a lot of dust and disinterest, Christianity continues to be one of the fastest, if not the fastest growing religion in the world. There are millions of people from diverse cultures, all the way from Hong Kong to Lagos in Nigeria, to Lima in Peru, who all claim that Jesus is more than just a first century Jewish rabbi. They all claim that there's something more to this guy. So who is he? Who is Jesus? I hope that as we kick off the sermon series today, A Skeptic's Guide to a Jewish Rabbi, I hope that during the sermon series we feel encouraged to be able to ask some of these tough questions about who Jesus is. Perhaps there may be questions like, why doesn't Jesus stop suffering if Jesus truly is God, as he claims? Questions like, well, sure, Jesus is nice, but why should I choose Jesus over other religions? There are so many other good religions out there. Why choose this guy? Or maybe questions like, well, isn't it actually really narrow-minded to believe that Jesus is the only way? During the next few weeks, we'll be encountering, exploring, answering many of these questions. And we're not afraid or anxious to tackle these tough questions because I'm convinced about something. I'm convinced that our truth can hold its own. Truth can hold its own. When you ask tough questions about something that is true, the truth doesn't collapse. Truth isn't fragile. Questions about faith are not inherently bad. They're not inherently destructive. They're not inherently harmful or hurtful or catastrophic. Rather, when we ask questions like this, about questions that invoke or inspire faith, it can actually lead to a deeper understanding of what truth is. Maybe there are some of us here this morning, we're exploring Jesus. Perhaps we're curious. Maybe we're even skeptical. You're welcome here. I want you to bring your tough questions here. I want you to bring your toughest, hardest questions that you feel need an answer. Maybe there's some of us here who've been journeying with Jesus for a long time. We believe, but we just need a little bit more room to believe, if you will. Bring your questions too. Every question here is welcome. Our questions, I believe, even our toughest, most skeptical ones about Jesus will help us get to a deeper, more vibrant, more empowering, more meaningful, more fulfilling, more life-transforming, more life-changing relationship, life, vision. You will be changed by asking the right kind of questions. So, today, the first question we're going to ask is this: how can we be sure that the earliest written records or biographies, or AKA the Gospels of Jesus, how can we be sure that these records are accurate? How can we be sure that they are reliable? How can we be sure that they are trustworthy? Now, behind this question, as it turns out, there is a load of other questions. Questions like, weren't the first eyewitnesses unreliable, superstitious, illiterate fishermen? What did they know, really? Some other questions behind this question is, well, didn't those first people who wrote down these first eyewitness records, if they can even be called that, didn't they have a hidden agenda? That's another question that is hidden behind this question. Or another question might be, well, how come their stories made it in, but all these other stories didn't make it in? Or how do we know that their stories aren't embellished or filled with human error and mistaken memories? Now, I'm not going to be able to answer all these questions today, but I'm hoping to at least tackle some of these questions today. For example, when we look at our gospel reading from Matthew, it does sound a little crazy. It does sound a little far-fetched. If you grew up in a community, in a culture that did not know or celebrate the birth of Jesus, some of these details sound a little far-fetched. For example, there are these wise men in verse 1 who are presumably, what we can say historically about them is that they were Persian astrologers from a Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. And they traveled thousands of miles from present-day Iran to present-day Israel looking for a baby. They believe that this baby is a king, and they believe that this baby is bound to be found in a palace. But they get there, and this baby is not in a palace, but rather they're told in verse 5 that this baby is actually going to be born in a small, obscure town that they've never even heard of called Bethlehem. It would be, for example, like if the Nobel Prize Committee was trying to figure out who they should give the next Nobel Peace Prize to. And they show up to New York City or Washington, D.C., or one of these big cities, and they say, who is the person that needs to get this prize? And they're told, you made a wrong turn. You got to go back down to Possum Bend, South Carolina, and that's where you'll find the person who needs to win this next Nobel Peace Prize. That's how the wise men would have felt, showing up in this place where they were hoping to find a king. But look at what else happens in verse 4. They show up to Jerusalem, the palace, expecting to find this baby king there, but instead they're met with another king named Herod, who is quite disturbed by all of this. And he has to verify prophecies from old Jewish religious scriptures written 500 years before him, and he verifies that this baby will indeed be born in Bethlehem. And so these wise men, they travel all the way down to Bethlehem, carrying the most strangest gifts anyone would ever want to take to a baby. Gold, frankincense, myrrh. We just had a daughter born 6 months ago. We needed diapers. I can't change a diaper with gold or frankincense or myrrh. But here they are in verse 11. They come, they visit this baby, they give him these gifts, and then they worship this baby. Why? All because they followed a star. That's the only reason. See, there's a lot of details in the story. If you were reading it from a particular perspective, you can look at it and say, that's actually crazy. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And perhaps that is you today. You're probably looking at the story and thinking to yourself, that is crazy. Why should I believe any of this story is true? In fact, if I cannot trust that this story is true, by extension, why should I trust that the entire eyewitness account written by this guy named Matthew is true? And by extension, why stop there? Why should we trust any of the gospel accounts written by any of the other gospel writers, Mark, Luke, and John? But let's look at the evidence. Let's look at why we have good enough reasons to believe that this stuff is true. First of all, our reading today is written by a guy named Matthew. And Matthew wasn't a superstitious, illiterate fisherman. Rather, Matthew was a learned, well-educated tax collector employed by the Roman Empire. And if you were the Roman Empire, and a lot of your income as an empire depended upon high taxes, you're not going to hire a superstitious, illiterate fisherman to go and collect your money for you. You're going to hire someone who has a very specific kind of personality, someone who's very detail-oriented, someone who cares about profits. And being a tax collector draws a very particular kind of personality. Personal story, 2 weeks ago, I received an IRS letter about a tax return error that I had made in 2016. That's a tax collector for you right there. That's not a fisherman. See, Matthew is a tax collector. He was a very well-learned, educated person who was very detail-oriented. So he's the one who's putting these details together. He's writing about something as an eyewitness, something that he's gone and interviewed people about to make sure that he has the right details. But apart from just this character evidence of Matthew being this very detail-oriented tax collector, look at the kinds of details he starts noting in this short little story. He notes that Herod is the king. You can see this, for example, in verses 2 and 3. Now, we know that Herod was a real person. Herod is mentioned multiple times outside of the Bible in extra biblical records, meaning in historical accounts outside of the Bible. What we also know about Herod is that we have all this archaeological evidence proving that he really did exist and he really wasn't a very good guy at all. For example, we have carbon-dated copper coins that say the kingdom of Herod that are found in modern-day Israel. We have ruins. Herod was known for building tons of buildings. He was a capital campaign connoisseur. There was not a building that he did not like to build. We have ruins for these buildings in present-day Israel, carbon-dated buildings. And what I would say is this: if we can believe the authenticity of Egyptian pharaohs and Egyptian pyramids that were built 2,000 years before Herod built any of his stuff, if we're willing to believe that, we can believe what we can about Herod as well. Because the stuff that he built, his ruins, are still there, and they're actually newer than all those pharaohs building ruins that we have in Egypt. So we have all this archaeological evidence about Pharaoh. We know that he really existed. We know that he was a Roman vassal king in Judea at that time. And we know that after he died, his children, he had 4 children, 1 daughter, 3 sons, they took over his kingdom. They formed what's called the Herodian dynasty. And their descendants would have been well and alive around the time that Matthew was compiling his eyewitness account about the life of Jesus, or Matthew's gospel. What we do know is this: Matthew stops working for this kingdom, Herod's descendants. He starts working for Jesus as one of his disciples. We know that Jesus did die by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, i.e., Matthew's previous employers. So Matthew now is writing about his former employers while they're still alive in defense of his new employer who just died. What's even more interesting is this: his old employers do not disagree with him. If I left a job under very poor circumstances and started working for my previous employer's competitors and started writing things about them that were true but negative, my previous employers would have something to say about it. But not in the case of Matthew. Because it shows you that he was so fastidious, so detail-oriented, so eager to be accurate and precise about what he was saying, even his opponents couldn't disagree with him. So you have, for example, this character witness of Matthew, a fastidious, detail-oriented tax collector, not a superstitious fisherman. You have these details that he writes down that no one disagrees with, including the people who have every reason to dispute and disagree with him. They don't say anything. And you have all of this put together. See, all of this matters because it shows us that there's this good enough evidence. There's good enough evidence in this gospel to show us that he was telling the truth, at least about this story. And if you apply the kind of rationale that I've shared with you to other stories that Matthew shares, you'll have similar lines of reasoning, similar lines that tell you, well, the evidence is good enough. In fact, you could take all of those lines of reasoning and you could apply them to all of the Gospels, and you'd come up with something similar. You'd say, well, there's good enough evidence here. There's good enough evidence to tell us that there's something unique about this Jesus person. He's more than just a Jewish rabbi. Rather, he is probably what those wise men who claim he was, which was they came and worshiped him as a king. Maybe there's something more to this Jewish rabbi than him just being a Jewish rabbi. Maybe he really is at least a king. At least a king. I want to shift gears here just a little bit. And it'll all make sense in just a minute, I promise. 15 years ago, I met a really pretty woman. And I felt like she liked me. Well, why did I feel like that? She didn't ignore my texts. She would answer when I called. She would laugh at my jokes, even though some of them were not that funny. I felt like she was into me. And so I asked her out. And next thing you know, Naomi and I have been married for 15 years, and we have 4 kids. Did I know for certain that Naomi was into me? I didn't. Did I have good enough evidence to take that next step? Yeah, I did. I had good enough evidence to take that next step. See, a lot of life is actually not about being certain about things. There's actually very few things that you and I can be absolutely certain about. A lot of life is actually making decisions on what I call good enough evidence. Good enough evidence. And what I'm about to say is that for Jesus, being more than just a Jewish rabbi, we have good enough evidence. It's pretty hard to be absolutely certain about a lot of historical things, but we have good enough evidence, and that's good enough. In our story today, we actually have 3 different kinds of people who had good enough evidence, and they all had different decisions that they made based on that good enough evidence. For example, the wise men in today's story, the only good enough evidence they had was a star. That was all they had. So you can look at this in verse 11. It was good enough for them to keep following that star all the way through, and by doing that, they found the greatest gift that their souls were looking for. A baby, whom they believed was more than just a baby. And they worshiped him. But you also had all the citizens of Jerusalem. They too had good enough evidence. And you can see them in verse 3. They had these 500-year-old prophecies that told them where this baby, this king, was going to be born in Bethlehem. How did they react? Well, it says that they were troubled, disturbed. They had good enough evidence, but they were confused about it. They were anxious about it. Meanwhile, you have King Herod, who also had good enough evidence. He had the wise men coming and telling him, hey, there's a king born in your town. Can you tell us where he is? He has these prophecies from these old Jewish scriptures. Hey, there's a king that's going to be born in Bethlehem. You got to go worship him. He too had good enough evidence. And what's his decision? Well, if you read on in Matthew, you realize his decision was to secure his power, his autonomy, his freedom, and try to get rid of any threat to himself being king by ordering one of the most bloody genocides that we know of in that part of the world. And we see about him as well. You see, all three groups of people had the same good enough evidence, but they all had three very different responses. Same good enough evidence, three very different responses. And maybe that's some of us here today. We're coming across and encountering some good enough evidence. Maybe there's some of us here today who feel like, I feel like that evidence is good enough. And I feel more confident about who I've placed my faith in. I feel more confident about Jesus being more than a rabbi, and that's good for me. I'm good to go. And I want to encourage you in that. I want to encourage you to keep taking more steps of faith. But perhaps there are some of us here this morning who are curious, maybe perhaps even skeptical. We're thinking, well, he's answered one of my questions, but I have about 5 other questions that I really need to be answered before I can take any more steps. Well, I encourage you to do something. I encourage you to keep pulling on those threads. Like I said before, the truth can handle its own. The truth can handle its own. I had a guy in my Bible study once many years ago. When I confessed to him that I had doubts, he looked at me and he said to me, well, that's okay. If truth is like a rock, none of your questions can damage that rock. And that's what I encourage you. If you're still skeptical, if you have questions like, well, I want to believe in Jesus, but why does he allow so much suffering to happen? That's a question that we're going to be exploring here in a few weeks. But I want you to keep pulling on that thread. Keep taking those steps of curiosity. Keep asking those tough questions because you never know. You never know where this good enough evidence is going to lead you. But I pray and hope that it does lead you to a place of where you experience this deep, fulfilling, life-changing relationship with God, with Jesus, who is more than just a Jewish rabbi.